You are live, Madam Chair.
Okay, welcome back. This is House Corrections and Institutions Committee. I'm sorry that we're a little late coming back. We had some technical issues with our getting onto Zoom and also getting back onto YouTube. We had to deal with some of our technology here in the room. We're picking up testimony on some testimony we've already received, but I wanted to do a little deeper dive in this so that the committee could really focus on this particular issue. It is in section 2, it's the Department of Children and Family Services, and there is $1 million being proposed in the capital budget out of the cash fund to begin planning for a permanent secure facility for our justice-involved juveniles. We did close down Woodside back in 2020. We've really had no facility for placements in state per se for some of our juveniles that need a more stable environment for a period of time. We did take a little bit of testimony on this a couple weeks ago, but it was really the focus was what we were going to do for a temporary facility, which was the planning for a couple pods that would be put up. There was money in the general fund budget adjustment that would go towards that. It's not in our capital bill, but we do have a proposal in our capital bill to begin the process of a secure stabilization facility, a permanent facility. And I wanted the committee to do a little deeper dive in this to really understand what the thinking is, what the projected total cost might be, and the timing of how the pods and how this proposed permanent facility will play together. So I thank the folks from DCF for coming back so that we can really just focus in on the capital request. So I don't know whether to start with DCF or start with BGS in terms of this. I can go either way.
Madam Chair.
Yeah.
I think it makes more sense for DCF to go first, only to continue to talk about the programmatic need, right? That is then going to drive the planning and design process. I know they talked about the gap in the system last time, but just to reiterate for the folks out in Zoom land.
What we need long-term.
Yeah.
We need long-term. So the deputy commissioner, I'm assuming we're putting you back on the hot seat?
Sure.
Come on up.
All right.
Great. Yes. And bring anyone that you need to with you, because I know you've got some folks with you here. So for folks, this is line 42, and in our book, it's page 37.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm, for the record, I'm Deputy Commissioner Erica Radke with the Department of Children and Family Services, Family Services Department. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for having us back. I know we wanted to talk about the $1 million in the capital bill, which is for a permanent facility. And I wanted to just sort of back up a little bit to talk about the reason we're starting off with a temporary facility is because of the urgent need we have to have secure stabilization for children and youth that are justice involved, and which is why we're pushing so hard to get that temporary facility up and running. And after that, while we're doing that, we want to be planning for a permanent facility because, of course, that would be so much more beneficial for the children and youth in our custody and care. And how we started talking about the permanent facility and what we do need the $1 million for is more for planning and designing and really selecting a location. It's really at the initial stages. And what we're envisioning is how I got involved was, and I'm going to be turning it over really quickly to Tyler Allen, our Adolescent Services Unit Director, because he was the one that brought me in on sort of the vision that I've really bought into as far as having a campus-like setting where we could have a secure facility and then possibly offshoots for children with developmental disabilities, and then also other areas for children that have less acute needs so that we can have a robust system of care all on one campus so that when children begin to cycle between different levels of acuity, we can have everything there in one spot, hopefully, so that it's easier to transfer you from one stage to the other with the expectation, hope that they get down to stabilization level where then they're possibly able to go back home, go back into the community, or maybe even to foster care. But having everything in one location also really gives you that economy of scale for education purposes, for cooking facilities, and a lot of things that instead of having so many separate areas spread throughout the state, it would be just that much more efficient, and also in terms of staff. So that was sort of the vision that they sold me on and that I'm really excited about. So Tyler, do you think you could fill in with some additional details for me?
Can we just interrupt a minute, because I think we have some committee questions here. Chip and then Wayne.
So is it anticipated that this would be one building that would house all these, more than one building?
Definitely more than one.
Okay.
Because for the secure facility,
Yeah.
that should be
Okay.
gated off from children with developmental needs that don't need to necessarily be locked up. They're not juvenile justice involved. That would be more outside of the perimeter. And
Okay.
then we would also have staffed secure facilities and regular hardware facilities. But this is sort of our dream.
Yeah, okay, I understand. Thank you.
Wayne and then Troy.
I like the dream, but in the short term also, so I'm gonna maybe get a little bit off topic. Wait. We heard from the prisons yesterday, and we've heard from hospitals in terms of the problems in emergency rooms and how we've got COs running from the prisons up there to deal with those problems, and then having short shift for the whole prison. So the immediate need, what do you see as the fastest fix for the hospital emergency room situation? And are these the people that would be involved? And because if we start pulling on one thing and now we help fix the other problem, then we can get from step A to step B faster. The long term, I like the big fix,
Right.
but that's not, we could have a meltdown before we ever get there.
Yes. And that meltdown is what does keep me up at night in terms of that short-term pod facility. And you're asking about the people that would be staffing the pods versus the emergency rooms. Is that correct?
Are the people in the emergency rooms the people that would go into the pod?
You mean in terms of like my team for family services workers?
Well,
I don't think so, Wayne. I think you're talking of youth that have mental health issues.
Well, they may be, but so.
There could be some behavioral health
Yeah,
specialists.
do you know much about the characteristics of the people that causing the issue in the emergency rooms? So that you could parse those out and know which ones your portion of this would deal with, and what magnitude of the total problem these ones would be.
I'm just thinking in terms of the youth that we have that sometimes will escalate and then end up in the emergency room. The people that would be staffing those youth at our, stabilization facility would go to assist the other hospital personnel that would be in the hospital. But our hope is that if we have that stability, there won't be so much movement around that we should not have to use those emergency rooms as much because you're in our own stabilization facility that will have not only behavioral health specialists, but also a nurse on duty.
So would these pods, some of these people be able to go to the pods in the short term?
Yes. Because it'll be a secure, hardware state, secure facility. But of course, if they do escalate and become deregulated, they could end up in the emergency room.
From the pods.
Yes.
Yeah, your emergency room issue is got many, many, many layers. There was also money in the budget adjustment for a possible contract with a hospital to provide mental health beds for youth in a mental health crisis. And that was worked through DMH. So there was money in BAA, I think it was almost $9 million to build those beds. That's not connected with us. And it's, may not be connected with the same folks that DCF has jurisdiction over. So there may be some overlap. But the issue is really more mental health issues.
Yeah, there's some slight overlap, but our youth are primarily those in our custody. And those may be children that are still in custody of their parents that don't necessarily touch the DCF.
A different population per se. Troy?
That was my question. If there was any merging of that general fund into this, because as I hear you start talking about a campus facility, I was just wondering if that, and including youth with developmental issues, but they're still under your jurisdiction.
Exactly.
So that's the.
So to put it bluntly, and maybe I'm off base, the proposal that's before us is how do we go forward in replacing Woodside? To put it bluntly, you're looking at a program needs, which may be different than what happened in Woodside, or it may be similar. But you also need a building or buildings. You also need a site to build on. And you also need to figure out the size.
The size, and then the next step would be finding an appropriate vendor to provide these services. And I do want to say that the kids that would have been at Woodside are the ones I would expect to be at our facility. But it's different in that this is an absolute focus on moving away from a correctional atmosphere and really trauma informed. And it's different. The kids may be the same, but our focus is 100% different.
That's why I kind of said the way I said it. So is the goal also to get Medicaid reimbursement for this as well? Because we lost Medicaid reimbursement at Woodside because the CMS was classifying it as a correctional facility.
Tyler, can you?
I would love to. Shall I stand?
Yes, just introduce yourself for the record, please.
Of course. Good morning. My name is Tyler Allen. I'm the Adolescent Services Director with DCF Family Services Division. And part of my responsibility is to oversee both the juvenile justice populations that DCF works with, as well as the Specialized Services Unit, who's responsible for placement of youth within residential care, both inside of the state and apart from the state. And so as I'm hearing the questions and how they're being framed, that question is an excellent one about Medicaid reimbursement. If we were to be able to develop a campus, there are some ifs attached to that. Could we find the location? Could we find the buildings? Could we develop them? Could we find the programs to serve it? So on and so forth. What we had proposed last year in our high-end system of care report plan was a 4-tiered approach to addressing the largest systems gaps that we currently have. One of those would be the introduction of what's called a PRTF program in the state of Vermont. It stands for a Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility. This is a Medicaid reimbursable model, so that would be a Medicaid reimbursed program. Theoretically, if we were able to find and develop a campus, it would in many ways be helpful to be able to serve both those populations in a campus setting. So when we're talking about perhaps a youth with developmental challenges, mental health crisis that could be served in the PRTF facility, we're talking about adopting and bringing in. If there could be a seamless transition, in my mind, away from a secure placement, which would require somebody to be juvenile justice involved, into that setting to match their mental health or acute treatment need, outside of the secure setting, I think to streamline that program would be really beneficial. And then as Commissioner Radke, or Deputy Commissioner Radke mentioned, the economy of scale of being able to have shared training opportunities, shared staffing, shared resources. There is a value to that. Absent the possibility of a campus, then we would still need all of these levels of care distinctly. So we wouldn't be intending to try to draw down Medicaid dollars for the secure portion of what we're describing. It would be for a PRTF level.
So my question is we've dealt in this committee for years about CMS Medicaid reimbursement. So if you do this on the same plot of land as a campus and you have a building with X number for the secure treatment of justice-involved youth. And then you also have on the same campus land, the PRTF, which is the one you're hoping to get Medicaid. Because they're on the same campus, would Medicaid look at that as a whole, or would they just look at that one building and program? The other question, is there going to be shared space in terms of administrative offices, in terms of rec area, in terms of dining, cafeteria? Is there going to be any shared space there that might impact Medicaid?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know if we've worked out all of those details, but I think that it would turn on if we got the opinion that Medicaid would be disallowed if we had those shared, interactions, then we would move away from that. Because I think it's important for us to be able to draw that Medicaid and to have a PRTF.
Right, so then my next question, are we tied to the 16-bed Medicaid reimbursement? If we have 18 beds, do we lose Medicaid for the PRTF?
PRTF, are you, when you say 16 bed, is that a reference to the IMD standard?
And Medicaid?
My understanding is that PRTF programs, because they're dealing with the youthful population under the age of 21, that those IMD restrictions don't apply. That being said, I think these questions are part of the planning questions of what we're thinking. We would like time and some. When we first said $1 million to invest in this, I think our thinking was we want to be simultaneously coming up with a secure stabilization program that is permanent, and I think that's where we were starting from. And at the same time, we're thinking of, are there opportunities to further enhance that program by developing this campus sort of thing? So I think these are exactly the questions that we're looking to answer within that year. My hope is that my knowledge is that there are programs in other states that serve both as a PRTF and a secure placement facility. I visited one that had both within one building with one structure. There was one portion of it that was PRTF, and youth were able to come and go from that part of the facility, and the other part of the facility was secure and youth couldn't come and go. And they actually did have some shared space, and they had to work around very specific staffing patterns of when the lunchroom could be used by one population versus another. They had to do creative things with gating and fencing. But I know it's possible that it exists elsewhere. And so I think that's what we'd be looking to do, is answer that question over a period of time.
Okay. So did one of you have a question?
Mine was IMD.
And the IMD? Yeah, someone must have been through this a few times.
Mine was pretty similar to what you just asked.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, just a quick question. I've been receiving some emails from people in northern Vermont who are describing the potential youth facility as full of violent criminals. So I guess I'm wondering, first of all, I don't like that terminology, but that aside, what is the range of types of charges that folks might have if they were going there? So if somebody, for example, had been charged with murder, would they go there because they're under 18? Or would there be a range of types of offenses, but not necessarily the most violent crimes in that particular facility?
The Big 12 offenses generally would not be part of that. Tyler,
I'll go ahead and step in,
Okay.
just because of my role in juvenile justice. So Big 12 offenses, so if we're talking about murder, tend to originate in criminal court. These are criminal offenses, depending on the age of the youth. But they can be served by the family court in some cases. And that gets very complicated depending on ages. The other part of the equation is if we had a fully functioning system of care, if DCF has that, there are restrictions in terms of DOC's ability to house youths under certain ages, because they have to keep those youths separate from their adult inmate population, so on and so forth. So we would envision a program that could meet the needs of anybody within the age range. That being said, there is a process that we've defined just last year called interest of justice process. And that means if there is a youth who has an acuity of danger associated with them on their adult criminal charges, a judge can find it that they can be held in an adult population. It is in the interest of justice to do so. So we have an avenue if there are people that exceed the safety concerns for a program we're describing. There is an avenue by which DOC can maintain them. That being said, I would envision this program in our healthy system of care that's specialized in serving juveniles to be able to meet any offense, criminal or otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ty.
So the 1 million that's in our capital bill for the committee is cash fund dollars to go towards the planning of how we move forward with a permanent system, with a long-term permanent system of care for our youth who are involved or under the custody. They would all be under the custody of the state. They all be under the custody of DCF.
They would not be under the custody of DCF necessarily, and I will add also to that, when we're discussing the PRTF program, that would be a multi-departmental approach to bringing something like that in. That's the level. DCF has kids that need that level of care that we send currently elsewhere in the country, but DMH also does, and Dale also does. So there would be youth that I would envision going into a PRTF level of care that are not just DCF youth.
So have you folks had this testimony upstairs in Human Services Committee at all on this? Because there were a couple members, and I feel really bad because we were full to capacity. There were a couple members from Human Services who wanted to come in and hear this. Because this will implicate policies within the House Human Services Committee. So have you folks reached out to them? Have they reached out to you about this capital request?
I don't believe so. I don't believe we've had testimony.
Because I know you worked on the pods.
Yes.
And there was confusion up there on the pods. And then a member of that committee came down when we did the deeper dive in the pods, and then they understood it a little better. But this needs to be done. There's some folks up there that I'm sure would be interested in the mental health treatment for the youth.
Madam Chair.
Mm-hmm.
For the record, my name is Jeffrey Pippinger. I'm the Director of Policy and Planning for the Department for Children and Families. And to that point, I think most of the conversations so far have been focused on that need for the short-term secure stabilization. This is the conversation we want to have, and to your point, we should be having across the board. But I think much of the attention from many different arenas is focused on that. What are you doing now? What's the short-term response to the needs? But what we certainly want to do is to get to those conversations and have those conversations about how we do this long-term. Because if we're only talking about the emergent crisis, we're never going to get to the proactive, what do we want to do and how should that be? Our intent is to have those conversations.
Okay. I'm really feeling that the two members from Human Services Committee should be down here, so I'm going to ask the page. If you could continue, I just want to go outside for a minute because I want to get a note upstairs. So if you could continue a little bit.
Are there any other questions?
And go.
Someone have their hand up? John, was it you?
I do, but I'm not sure.
Oh, Wayne.
But I'm not sure that, so we shouldn't wait for people upstairs to get here before I ask the questions. Because
Okay. Yeah, Connor?
Just background, how many beds did Woodside have and what was the census like? How many of those were taken up usually?
I believe at its largest it was 30, but at the end I believe it was 5 beds. There are times there were 0 kids or 0 to 1 or 2 kids in the facility. And these pods we're planning on having 8, and we haven't really discussed for our permanent facility how many we're secure.
Great, thanks.
John?
$1 million, where would we be when that money's expended? How far along?
So we're starting to get into BGS territory when we start talking about the next steps in planning and programming, the cost, and the schedule. So that isn't really a fair question for DCF, that would be one for us.
So maybe it is time to bring BGS to the table and.
Well, we can always bounce back and forth too.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
And then it's really up to you, Sabrina, either I can just jump in and do high level, or you can jump whatever you want to do.
I think we're high
Hey,
level.
Jeffrey, did you have anything else that you wanted to,
I don't think so.
okay, at this time, okay. All right,
Maybe.
Commissioner, if you would take the seat.
For the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch, and I am the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. I want to say just a couple upfront comments. Number one, you're all asking amazing questions. A lot of the questions that you're asking are questions we're going to answer during that planning and programming phase. Because right now, we haven't even started. So, I mean, in terms of BGS, it's really our ability to work with DCF to understand what their needs are for the populations they serve. And then we can come back to you with a plan and say, this is what that plan looks like. So we haven't started right now, right? We only have, we're using some of our planning funds to work with DCF on the pods. So we're working with them on the temporary, and then we're working with them, as we said the last time, on the Wyndham County Sheriff's Office too. That's lease space, but we're helping with design and construction. So that's really where our primary focus is at the moment. But I do want to commend DCF for not only focusing on temporary, but now we're going to start on permanent. I know there's been a lot of concerns around whether or not the pods are temporary or permanent, and what does that mean? If we start go today, if we got permission or approval from this committee and obviously the Senate, and this appropriation was supported, then starting on July 1, we would be working with DCF. We would be putting together an RFP to hire an architect to start planning and programming. That process, that contracting process takes about, 3 to 4 months, sometimes a little longer, a little less. It just depends on how many requirements we're putting inside of that RFP, and then how long we're giving people to respond, and then the number of questions that we get from architects and engineers during that bidding phase. And so again, the timeline is somewhat dependent. Somewhere between 3 to 4 months is reasonable. And then once we get an architect on board, really what they're going to start to do is they're going to start to interview. So they're going to interview DCF. Architects always ask a lot of questions, and the reason why they're asking all those questions is because they're trying to better understand what the requirements are of the client, which in this case is DCF. So basically, our goal is to run concurrent tracks, both on the temporary, temporary and Wyndham facilities, while we're concurrently hoping to run this track for planning and programming for a permanent facility. And then when we talk about campus, because I know that term gets thrown around a lot and people have very different images in their head about what we mean when we talk about a campus. If I'm hearing DCF correctly, I think what they're saying is they serve at least 2 populations, if not more, and their preference is to serve them in one location, which allows for lots of benefits, which again, planning and programming would take a look at and provide what those pros and cons are, but the benefits of doing so. But I want to just be careful because I know it's been coming up and we've been hearing it on our side. This is not one giant campus to put, DOC together with DCF with other AHS facilities. It's not what we're talking about. This is to serve DCF's population and their population, and obviously the other ones that you mentioned, but would all be served in this campus style. But what I envision is what you said, 2 to 3 buildings, however many populations that we're serving on a single site. That's what we're talking about. So really the money would be used to start planning and programming. $1 billion is quite a bit of money, right? So then we would be able to continue to use that appropriation to move into design. There'll be a check-in point with the committee when we come back next session. We would provide what that planning and programming looks like. And obviously we would continue to seek approval to move forward on what that vision is.
If I can interrupt, because we do have 2 folks here from the House Human Services Committee. And I'm sorry when you first walked in, you turned around. I know we were at capacity, but I really wanted you folks in the building. So I'm glad you came right back down. So this is our first really in-depth look at this. I know we had the conversations about the pods and Representative Brumstead sat in on that. what is before us in the capital budget, just to bring you folks up to speed, is there's $1 million being requested to begin planning on how we start addressing a permanent facility for the housing of juveniles that are in our justice system, as well as folks under DCF. The Deputy Commissioner of DCF presented their plan, sort of thinking in terms of doing a campus style where there would be a secure facility for those justice-involved youth. There would also be some transition facilities or step down to less acute needs, and then maybe some development youth with developmental needs. There's thinking of maybe a PRTF, which is a psychiatric residential treatment facility for youth. We talked about Medicaid reimbursement, the IMD issue for the PRTF. Those are all things that would need to be vetted. And we just shifted to the Commissioner of BGS, where that BGS is responsible for the actual planning and RFP process of going out to architects and engineers to come back with some proposals. When the commissioner talks about looking at planning, not just space, site needs, but programming, it is not programming of DCF. It is programming within the world of BGS in terms of what do we need for water and sewer? What do we need for electrical? What do we need for acreage? What do we need for cafeteria space? What do we need for rec space? That's what they're talking about, not the programming of providing program services to the population. So I just want that to be clear when she said programming. So there's $1 million being asked for in the capital bill to begin the process of BGS to go out there with an RFP to contract with architect or engineers to figure out the bigger scope. And that's when there will be conversations with DCF to figure out what is needed in their world and how we can construct or what we need to look for building wise and land wise. Does that make sense?
You said it so well.
Exactly.
So that's what we're at for the two folks in human services. Wayne, and then we'll open it up for you folks for any questions too.
That's exactly where my concern is, because I haven't heard from DCF, and we haven't heard projections of how many bodies, how many people, and have you projected that through time, given the history coming forward to this point too? Because BGS is gonna have to build something, but they have to know how big to build it, and you're gonna give those. So what kind of analysis in your planning do you have to spell out the types of people, the types of facilities you need for those people, the types of treatment, the numbers in the past and projected in the future, so that when you size something that's gonna be adequate and not gonna lead us right back into the same problem in a few years because it's not built to scale?
I'll go ahead and take this one. I appreciate that question a lot, and it's a really challenging number to come up with right now, in particular because the last 3 years have been very funny. Because we've been housing people in levels of care that we would not place them in had we a healthy system of care. So it's really hard to account for what youth are we placing in a staff secured crisis stabilization facility when they really do need a level of care. There is a safety need that we would like to see them securely housed somewhere, yet absent a secure program, we're forced to utilize this other one. So the number is very difficult to come out to. We've kind of done multiple different analyses of how many individual kids at that kind of granular level. The numbers we're generally coming up with are for that secure stabilization program. We're talking about an 8-bed facility. We're talking about a 6-bed facility for the secure treatment population, which that conversation was related to the project that's been ongoing for a couple of years now. So, as you merge those two together, it's 14, 15. The PRTF population is taking into account how many DCF youths do we have, how many DMH youths, how many Dale youths at any given time. Generally, where that number sits would be about 15 Vermont beds. That being said, a PRTF program is they tend to be, a lot is required to become a PRTF. You need to have medical care, it's under clinical direction. Most PRTF programs are much larger than a 15-bed facility, and so it would be really challenging to try to put forth, we're only willing to build a 15-bed program because we might not get any bidders that are interested in operating that. So that could be a larger facility of which Vermont contracts proportion. But generally, to your question, 15 in that population. And so I think that those are the general numbers we're talking about across all the levels of care that we're proposing.
So do you have any real time or any weekly ability to know how many people are in the system at different levels?
Now we update chart every 2 weeks of where all the kids are in the in-state residential system of care. But we also keep real time. This is all the kids in the country. That being said, we can't assume that the programs we're looking to build to fill these vital gaps in Vermont are going to be always the best program to match the needs of youth who we have elsewhere in the country. We might be looking to place youth still in a specialized setting that is somewhere else because we can't build every type of specialized setting. This is just the most critically needed.
I understand.
And this is Erica Radke again, Deputy Commissioner. I wanted to talk about, when we're talking about numbers for facilities, we have a lot of internal conversations about making sure we have enough beds to meet our needs, but we also don't want to get into a situation where if you build it, then they will come. We don't want to have it where we're just filling a need. So we are trying to find that sweet spot. And as Tyler's indicating, we're really trying to make sure it's data-driven.
If I may add just one more onto that, is that we don't necessarily also want to add A plus B plus C plus D equals the total number of beds in a facility that we're talking about. It may very well be when we get to the planning stages and we're having these conversations and investigating agreements, whatever it may be. We might determine that there are these populations at this location, the campus for part of the population, and then there might have to be a separate setting for another population. So I just don't want that to be a cumulative snowball effect. So that we're next building an enormous facility, we don't want the next thing.
The last point I'd like to make along these lines too, and I think this really picks up on what both my colleagues are speaking to, is that currently what we have is quote unquote log jams within the system. So we have high acuity needs individuals, and we talk about emergency rooms or secure placement or wherever that is, that remain stuck in a level of care because there isn't another one for them. And without being able to quickly move from one to the next, all of the systems become at capacity very quickly. So it also is a thing that is a confounding variable to coming up with concrete numbers for you, but we do weekly kind of generate best guesses.
So you're flow charting out all this so that you can find those bottlenecks and figure out solutions or ways around the bottleneck?
I would say relative to this conversation, flow charting this out would absolutely be part of the process.
Michelle, and then Troy.
Yeah, I would love to hear one of you folks that's representing DCF speak a little bit more about the rationale behind the campus model. It sounds to me a little bit puzzling that, unlike in a system, say in corrections, where you have the secure corrections facility, and then you build a reentry facility on the same property, and people from one population are growing into the other. What you've described today was people with DCF custody, people that are justice involved, people that are developmentally disabled, people that are, all these different needs, putting them in the same place doesn't necessarily make sense to me. If you take somebody who has severe psychiatric needs and you're putting them on the same campus with somebody who's justice involved, that doesn't necessarily make sense. And that's not necessarily serving either of those populations. So I would love to hear more about why you think that might work, because I have a lot of questions.
That's a good question. And for some of, maybe for our developmentally delayed youth, they may not necessarily always be in the mix. But when you're talking about your juvenile justice involved youth, staff secure versus hardware secure, there's a lot of emphasis on getting them stabilized so that they can move down to the lower steps. So a lot more of the flow between steps will be with that juvenile justice involved population. They may or may not necessarily be intertwining always with someone from the PRTF, but it all depends on the level of acuity and stability and their particular needs.
If I may add just another point of context, Vermont is a unique state, and in my view, very progressive amongst all the states of the union, that our department is able to oversee simultaneously those youth who are involved with DCF from a child welfare perspective and those youths that are going through the juvenile justice systems. And for most states, they bifurcate those populations. They have a division of youth services or something like that that's specifically like a DOC, like, I shouldn't say that, I shouldn't characterize that way, but working with the juvenile justice population specifically and distinctly. And I think the advantage to maintaining this Vermont model is that we take a holistic approach to serving every youth in our care. So every youth who's going through the justice system, we're not looking at them based on, at the starting point, their criminal charge or their delinquent charges that bring them to us and give us authority to be involved in their life. We're thinking about what are the factors with their family environment, with their mental health situation, with their developmental needs, with their educational needs. We're taking into account all of those components while we assess what's the appropriate place for this young person to be. And so I think we take a similar approach to all these populations, and what we see is for the vast majority of justice-involved youth who need this level of care, there are mental health drivers in that conversation. It's why we're not framing any of these facilities as detention facilities or carcerative facilities at all, because they're all different levels of treatment facility. Now, a person has to be justice involved in order to hold them securely. But that's the only place I draw a distinction with these programs. It's really about matching the best need to that youth where they're at. And so a person could be justice involved, but their needs could be met within the non-secure portion of it better. And so long as we can safely do that, I think that's the place they need to go. And so I do envision a world where a person is housed securely in a stabilization program and very quickly can move into a step-down program or even a community-based program that's outside of this campus. The goal is to move them away from their highest level of care as quickly as possible. So.
All right.
I'm changing directions a little bit. Is that okay? I'm going to change directions a bit.
That's fine.
I want to be really deliberate about bringing this conversation into intersection with the conversations we've been having on how the carceral system has so clearly been documented as impacting Black and brown Vermonters at a much higher rate, right? That's conviction rate, that's length of stay. Do you have that demographic data on youth involved? I know, correct me if this is that played part of the decision of closing down Woodside, the rate at which we are keeping Black youth incarcerated there. Do you have that demographic?
I don't have that demographic information right here now. That is something we track. Generally speaking, I would say similar to everywhere in the country, we are well aware that there is disparity when it comes to youth of color. As compared to white youth, we do have challenges to our data system to being able to organize the data in the way that's always the most helpful. And not only within our own data system, the court data systems are varying too. So we report out federally on these metrics annually. And we recognize where the disparities are. We also utilize, I don't want to go down this another rabbit hole. So yes, I'm sorry I don't have clear statistics for you right now on what proportions of youth who were held at Woodside, youth of color as opposed to others.
Is that something you can send to
I think it is.
I did, yeah.
Let me do Chip first and then I'll go to Representative Donahue.
I thought I heard both of you reference whoever will run this facility. Is the plan to contract the entire cadre in this facility to one entity that will run the whole deal?
We haven't gotten that far.
Okay. Okay, I
But
won't.
the plan is to put out an RFP for.
It will be, okay,
Yes,
all right,
but I don't
interesting.
know whether it would be more than one
Uh-huh,
vendor or not, but that's the
Okay.
initial plan.
all right, interesting, yeah.
You know, like I was saying, part of it is a dream, and we may end up not having our campus because our primary driver is getting that permanent, secure facility, but we're hoping while we're here to build upon it.
Okay, very good, thank you. Jeffrey, yeah.
I'd also add that, it's circular, right, because these are conversations that come up in the planning, because depending on what the site might be, and what the setting and how big that is, or it may impact some of those.
Okay, yeah.
That's what land you can find.
Yep.
And where the community is willing to take it. I'm gonna go to Representative Donahue and then I'll go to you, Tristan. So,
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to actually respond to the question because we do have some data from the council, the advisory council, which indicates in terms of youth arrests, Black youth represent nearly 9% of all youth arrests, but less than 4% of the youth population. And there was a Burlington-specific study that found that Burlington has a 16% Black youth population, but 44% of the youth age 17 and under who were arrested are Black youth. So we see that clearly, and I know that at Woodside they tracked it more closely, and there was an extremely high disproportion. So that's been a concern we've talked about in our committee some, that as we build restore secure beds as we had at Woodside, without addressing implicit bias throughout the justice system with juveniles, inevitably it will again disproportionately lock up youth from the Black population.
thank you for that, Ann. Tristan?
Thank you, Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner. Is $1 million in the cash fund a lot of runway for planning for a project that is, where I'm sitting, hard to understand, sort of in a sense of population, bubble diagram, flow chart, what we're getting for the money?
I'm gonna bring Sabrina into this a little bit because she knows the percentage, but usually we try to base what we request for planning and design on what we believe the total cost of the project may be. Now, haven't even started yet.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you know what the total cost is at this point, and how did you come up with that $1 million figure, right? That's a tough question to answer because again, we're basing it. So to give you an example, if it's one building versus two buildings, right, we talked about today, then it is going to be a different price tag. And we don't know the answer to that yet, right? Because we haven't even started planning and programming and we don't have a proposal yet for the administration and the legislature. So we felt that $1 million was a good amount of money to start with. In terms of how accurate that number is, that's a challenging question to answer because we don't know anything at this point, right? We're just starting in the very beginning. And I can't remember, generally speaking, what the AE percentages of the total cost of a project, generally speaking.
So an AE cost of a project is generally somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total cost of construction.
And that's architectural and engineering.
Yes, apologize.
So 10% of $1 million is 10 million at least. And that was gonna be my question, how much, I mean, we know what a secure residential may cost per bed, which is about $1 million per bed. A correctional facility is a little higher than that per bed for construction, once you bring in land acquisition, infrastructure. That's so, if we're talking 8 beds here, 6 beds there, another 15 beds, we're talking a substantial chunk of change for this. Just to put that in context for folks. And of course, we may have thoughts on what part of the state we'd like to have this placed, but we have nothing concrete at this point. what part of the state would DCF like this to be placed? That's a tough question, because you've got to look at staffing issues, you've got to look at transportation issues. Do we look at current state-owned property, which I assume we would start looking at first, or purchasing property? So any thoughts on
That's
that?
all part of that planning and programming process, right? First, we need to understand where requirements are. So to your point, what type of infrastructure do we need? Where is it best located in terms of service providers, in terms of access to medical, for example? All of those different things come into play. So we don't know at this point, because again, we haven't even started yet. And we always look to our state-owned land whenever possible, because, if we can utilize existing state-owned land that works for the needs of our customer, we want to do that, right? Because that's the best opportunity for taxpayers, right, to bring in that project at the best cost. So we're going to look at lots of different things, but again, and I hate to do this because then it's going to cause confusion, and I know I'm going to get some looks around the room, but I just want to say you've been listening a lot to what we've been doing with DOC. It's not DOC, to be very, very clear. But in terms of the process that we've been going through with DOC and HOK as our architecture and engineering firm is very similar to what we're going to be doing with DCF. So we'll be looking at those population trends, we'll be looking at the different types of populations, we'll be developing those requirements, and from that, we'll be making some recommendation on what this vision looks like. And for the committee, I'm just going to throw this out there. Let's say it's 2 buildings, just making this up. Could be 4 buildings. I don't know at this point, right? One of the things we could be doing is we could say, all right, we're going to phase this over time. So I'm going to build my first building, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask for money for my second building. To everybody's point, we may come back and say, gee, we only found this parcel of land and it's only going to allow us to build 1 building in this location. So there's so many unknowns at this point that we can't answer, but that's the whole point of the planning and programming process. But it will look similar to the one that we've been going through, but not the same, because it's not the same population, but it will be similar to the same process we've been going through with DOC and HOK. And as part of putting out the RFP for the architect and engineering firm, we always ask for an expert in that field. So if you think about the Essex facility, we had an expert there. If you think about DOC, we had an expert there. We will do the same thing for DOC. So we will bring in a firm, DCF, too many acronyms. We will bring in a firm that has specialty expertise in that field. And we're doing that intentionally because we want to make sure that we're designing these facilities to meet the needs of that population.
So Eric, you had your hand up?
I just wanted to caution us all to be careful about bed math. We are as guilty as anyone else of using it when we are making a rough estimate about a structure. Some people will say that a correctional facility is X per bed, but the reality is that the beds are a very small part of the final cost of a project. And if we have 2 buildings on 1 parcel, they can share a heat plant or they can share water and sewer service. And so really what costs us is the programming core. The ultimate housing units are almost incidental to the overall cost of acquiring land and building out a large facility. It doesn't mean that it's not good shorthand for some of these internal conversations, but as they're all coming together, I want us to remember that cuts both ways.
And a secure facility is going to cost more to build than a step-down facility. It doesn't have to be building secure like a secure facility does for that. And then if you do separate it out and they're in different, you have to purchase different pieces of property, then you've got to build that infrastructure. That could be a more expensive path. But the flip side of that, it may be spread out more across the state, which may be helpful to the residents in the state. So that's what we have to balance. So we're at the very, 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 very beginning, very, very beginning stages. And the sooner we can get a start on this, the sooner those pods will no longer be needed. Wayne, did you have your hand up or anything?
I'm just more of a comment. I mean, it's like, I'm trying to wrap my mind around all the various elements of this. between corrections, between mental health issues, between child issues, and secure versus all the various steps along the way. And I don't see, well, has there been any high level, I'm not gonna say high level, it has to be the people who know what's going on. But have all the agencies get corrections, child services, everybody get together and say, oh, look, here's our problem. The whole problem, all of it. And here are the elements that are most critical, or we could melt down tomorrow or very soon, and we don't have enough officers in the prisons to deal with those, or you have people floating around the state that don't have the place to go because there's no secure facility for a child or something like that, where we get into some crisis situation. So a group, so that you were able to identify the short-term things that you could do to stave off something really bad, but then prioritize so that you say, well, here's where we need to go. And here's how many people and the kinds of facilities we need. And if we can get these facilities, how long will it take? Will it be the right amount of time? Do we know how many people we expect to have in those? And if we can't have all the types of facilities we'd like to have, is there some other option out of state or someplace else where people could deal with certain aspects of that? So I'm looking at an integrated look at, what's the comprehensive look of the whole problem that we got. And has anyone worked on that at all? Is there any report or anything like that that's happened?
Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to. Well, happy to try and answer that. I think that if the question is there one giant room where everybody's sitting down with a giant, whiteboard and kind of mapping it all out? Yeah. But that's not to say that we don't have intra-agency and inter-agency conversations about these same topics. They may be happening in different spaces. DMH, Dale, and DCF all meet regularly. I would say that every 2 weeks to talk about the systems needs and what we should be doing to address some of their shortfalls, and how we collaborate together to address shared populations and systems that impact those other systems of care. We're trying to, I think there's been a lot of movement to getting out of the siloed approach to the work that we do in the agency toward a more collaborative intra-agency work. Because the reality is that more often than not, we are, there's a Venn diagram overlap of the folks that we serve.
So I appreciate it, and I think that's good that you're doing that, without flow charting it all out, without doing that, and you're piecemealing everything. And piecemealing, look, things can fall through the cracks, or out of sequence, or stepping on the other person's foot, kind of thing. And so
the whole part of the architecture and engineering firm is to come in and look at flow. So much of what we're doing in the beginning is looking at a lot of data and working with DCF on all of that data. You're right. It is a giant puzzle. I 110% agree with you, but that's the whole point of bringing in an architect and an engineer.
See, I'm not worried about you.
Okay. Well, we're going to be working with them, and we're going to have an architect and engineer. We're going to work with them on flow and numbers and where are these people going and what is the system of care and where are all these people in different places and locations, and it will ultimately be up to DCF to prioritize, because the other thing I think you were mentioning as well, I've got, we're serving different populations, which one do I start with first? And I think ultimately that's where DCF has to come in and say, okay, this one's on first, this one's on second, this one's on third. Here's why they are prioritized the way that they are. But all of that will be, and I don't want you to feel like I'm just saying that that's the whole point of this planning and programming studies, to look at flow and numbers and come up with that vision and come back to you in a year.
They will dig into all of that part, because you can't.
Lots of data back and forth.
Yeah, because your part of this is the operational part of getting things built. But that program part of what, and knowing where all those people, what they are, how many there are, and what needs they have, it's in their bailiwick.
That's right, but we need that information to be able to come up So the buildings are gonna house these populations, so we need the information from them to be able to make a recommendation on the types of populations, the number of beds per population, and what that ultimate vision looks like. So yes, we're gonna need a lot of data from them, and again, similar to, but very different from the DOC study where it did look at populations, and it is looking at flow and how many beds do we need to serve different types of populations. So it's going to be very, very similar, different population, similar process that we're doing with DOC at the moment.
And I agree with you in terms of us all getting in a room, sort of an AHS group to really hash out who needs what. And because there is a lot of commonality, overlap between the different populations that we serve. And as Jeff just said, we are starting to meet regularly, and that's actually been really beneficial, and that wasn't always that way, even in the 2 years that I've been here. And I think the next step is what you're talking about in terms of getting that big whiteboard and really mapping it out. So the process is starting, and I have found it to be able to have that type of camaraderie with our other departments has been very useful, because we've got a lot more in common than I think sometimes we used to think.
And I appreciate that, but what came to light pretty clearly, there's one department that's missing at that table, and that's DOC. They're in the Agency of Human Services. A lot of the clientele of Dale, DCF, and DMH ultimately end up in corrections. And folks who are in corrections have family members who are clients in the other services. So DOC, again, is missing at the table. They're the orphan. And they need to be at the table because what they deal with is a much larger clientele, and it's all coming out of their budget and dealing with a lot of needs that are dealt with in the other departments. So that's my soapbox. Chip, and then we'll go to Representative Small.
Just a quick comment. I think the step-down approach is one of the more encouraging things that I've heard about this whole process, or this whole plan, I should say. I think that it can really generate motivation for some to move into another area. I think it's not a cookie-cutter approach, which is known to be a failure. And I think that that's one of the best things I've heard about the whole program, is that it really can encourage our young people to try and move to another place and get better.
Representative Small from Human Services. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Recognizing the issues with IT and collecting data, I just want to make sure that the agency has all of the data necessary to be able to put this plan in place.
Nobody ever has enough data.
Our data system, it's ancient, it's old as the hills, but we have been able to get some carry forward money the last 2 cycles, and that will be government match. So we are moving forward with our comprehensive child welfare information system. We're hoping to putting out an RFP to get a project manager and some other folks to start doing the initial work for the modules for CWIS. We still will need additional funding because I believe it's a 9 modular system. But we are able, if we have enough money and enough confidence, that we're going to be able to start getting that system going. And once you have the CWIS system, that's when you're able to not only draw down the 4E money that we're losing out on right now, but the system is robust enough to do that type of analysis where you can get a really good read on your populations, including issues like race.
And if I could just add, as an add-on too, that's a long-term solution to your question that we're very excited about at DCF. But on the short term, the advantage to being in Vermont is that our numbers are relatively small, and so as data needs are identified, specific question, we will manually tabulate the data we have to. And so as those important questions come up throughout this planning process, should we be so blessed with a planning process, we'll get the data we need to get as through work hours.
Wayne.
So you have a limited population, so you don't have a lot of records to deal with. So how many fields would you have? What's the kind of What's the number of categories of information, just roughly, that you put into this thing? 100, 50, 40?
I think I was framing my response in terms of if there's a data request, we need to know the number of youths who are in such and such a situation over the past 3 years.
But you're talking about a comprehensive management system, a computer system.
System.
Yeah, computer system. So, but I'm just trying to get an idea of some scope of the size of this thing, because you have a limited number of records, how many people are in the system, those are the records down. But for each person in there, obviously you get their name and you get how wide would this spreadsheet be if it was a spreadsheet?
Well, it is a spreadsheet now. It's a number of various spreadsheets for the type of information they use, which is why we're trying to shift over. But in terms of the specific data that they're capturing, I'm gonna have to ask those folks that are flooding over those spreadsheets right now. That's something I don't have in my fingertips.
Okay, I was just trying to get an idea whether or not this was a huge computer problem, programming problem, or a relatively small one.
CWIS at large is a huge project in and of itself, and CWIS, the value of that is it interfaces with other, you can interface with other systems, things like that. So there's many, many variables in terms of that. If we're getting down to the data we need to make informed decisions about what programs are being developed by this, I think we'll have to be looking at what are the specific, what are the variables? What's the time frame? What are the individuals who are in what placement? It'll be a matter of counting and spreadsheets. And it's probably, hundreds. There's lots, but it can be done.
So we're bumping to the noon hour, and this has been good testimony. What I would recommend, folks, both folks that are here from DCF as well as BGS, I would recommend you reach out to the House Committee on Human Services, and I would ask that the two members from the House Human Services Committee relay this as well to your chair. I think this would be important testimony for House Human Services Committee to hear, because we need voices to join us when we do markup, to let us know their thoughts. There's $1 million being requested in the capital bill to begin planning for this. BGS would be the initial folks going out with the RFP, but they would be in conversation, of course, with DCF. So I think it'd be important if House Human Services Committee in the next couple of weeks could have you folks in, all of you that are here, and do this presentation up there. I think that would be helpful for all concerned, so that we just don't put money in a capital bill to start a process that our policy committees are not aware of for that. So I would ask of that. Ann?
Just a memory note also that the approved money in the BAA for that first piece and, getting the data and actually identifying the needs there, they also have to come back to us.
In March.
I think it's by March 31st. And that really does tie in with
But by then our bill will be out. Our
Yes.
capital bill will be out
understood,
by
right?
then, heading over to the floor or headed to the Senate. So when we do markup, we're gonna start markup in a couple of weeks, or maybe at the end of next week at the rate we're going. We can start markup, moving dollars around, so we're gonna need some dot our i's and cross our t's. So we're done for the morning. We are due back at 12:30. It's a very short lunch if people can do it. We have Becky coming in. You might want to give Becky a heads up. We might be 5 minutes, 10 minutes late. But we'll be back this afternoon. I want to thank you folks for coming back. I know people were saying, why are we having you? We came in already once. Why are you having us back? I wanted to do a deeper dive. I really understand.
Back, and thank you all.